Greetings, everyone. This is Canadian Meets the South, episode 12, The Rise and Fall of Light Horse Harry Lee. Um, I forgot the author. But if you don't know, Light Horse Harry Lee, or Henry Lee III, was Robert E. Lee's father. And I'm reviewing this book. I have to say that this book also came from a nationalist lens, used nationalist language to describe the United States. But it started off with the origins of the Lee clan, if you want to call it the Lee family, back in the 17th century. Um, the the Henry Lee the First was from England, and he traveled to Virginia, like a lot of aristocrats. I talked about Albion Seed last podcast that it was uh the aristocratic gentry of Virginia that Lee was part of, and Henry Lee II was actually around the same age as George Washington. I think a couple years older, and his wife was courted by George Washington when Washington was about 17. I mean, this was before they married. But um, George Washington was known before the American War for Independence as a hero in the French and Indian Wars back in the 50s. And Henry Lee II knew him and was on friendly terms with him, and so did his son, Henry Lee III. His son knew George Washington from a very young age and admired him. And both Lee II, his father, and George Washington had served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the precursor to the House of Delegates today. And um, let's see, what else can I talk about? The story is about, the book was really about Henry Lee III. It starts off a lot of it, the first half especially, was about his involvement in the war for independence. And there were a lot of stories, and his admiration for General Nathaniel Greene was part of it, but I don't really want to focus too much on the war per se. I'd rather talk about the politics because this is what I was really interested in. He uh he was a supporter of the Constitution. Um, well, his father, Lee II, died in 1787, but when they were replacing the Constitution, like in Virginia's Constitutional Convention in 1788, um, Patrick Henry and George Mason were against the Constitution. Um, while as the main guys for the Constitution, besides Henry Lee III, were James Madison, um, Edmund Randolph, and John Marshall. Um, Interestingly, when he was Henry Lee III was classmates with James Madison and Aaron Burr back in, I think, Yale, um, in New Jersey. I keep getting Yale and Princeton mixed up, but they were classmates. And uh, what I found interesting was when Patrick Henry had given the speech we the people or we the states. Um, we remember talking last year in The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, in which Davis says talks about this, but he mentions James Madison's um, response, which was "We the people," well, referring to the preamble of the United States Constitution, ref, uh, referred to the people of the sovereign states, like in each, and in the Confederate Constitution, in the permanent Constitution, it said, "We the people of the Confederate States, with each state acting in its own sovereign and independent capacity," or something along the lines of that, right? But Henry Lee III, his response, which was the day after Patrick Henry gave the speech, was that he was an American and that he fought alongside people from Northerners, like in Virginia, in New Jersey, and he had this brotherhood with them. But in all local affairs, he was a Virginian, but he was an American in the nationalist sense, and he certainly believed more than Madison in this one people theory. Um, Henry Lee III was, close with both George Washington. He was the right hand man of George Washington, you could say. He served as aide de camp under Washington, and he was part of the inner circle alongside Alexander Hamilton, whom he had a good relationship with. Um, but even though his son fought, you could say, for the Virginian, a Jeffersonian version of Virginia, which was based on states' rights, Henry Lee III was, for the most part, much more a nationalist than his famous son. Um, he, but yeah, even when George Washington was in office, he had a good relationship with him and Alexander Hamilton. When Patrick Henry became the leader, became like a Federalist, and he ran. This was around 1798, because he ran when elected was elected as a Federalist, and I remember, John Randolph of Roanoke had said to Patrick Henry that he did admire Patrick Henry. This was 1798 was when John Randolph of Roanoke was first elected to the House of Representatives. But Henry did die before he took his seat. But I didn't know until listening to this book that Henry Lee told George Washington that that Patrick Henry now has become more friendly to the Constitution and that he should be appointed to the Supreme Court. But Patrick Henry refused. He declined. I guess it's kind of late, 9 minutes in, but the reason why he was called Light Horse Harry Lee was because he was a cavalryman, not really a foot soldier, and actually his son Henry Lee IV, who was Robert E. Lee's half brother, was known as Black Horse Harry Lee, was also, I believe, a cavalryman. But after that, after say 1798, well, hold on, they were sorry. No, I'm getting confused here. I'm sorry. Because 1798, George Washington was already left office and John Adams was president. But Patrick Henry had become a Federalist earlier. So Lee told George Washington to consider him for the Supreme Court. But even in Henry Lee had served in both the House of Representatives and in the House of Delegates, and as governor of Virginia, actually. And when he was governor, this is like 1791 to 1794, George, the Whiskey Rebellion occurred in 94, and he had left Virginia to take up, to become the leader of the army against the Whiskey Rebellion. I've talked about how this is unconstitutional. How uh, like putting down the Whiskey Rebellion was unconstitutional in previous episodes, but he was not reelected after that. He was replaced after that because he left Virginia. But during George Washington's presidency, when it became clear that Alexander Hamilton wanted to tax the South, and he had come up with the tariff of 1792, Henry Lee did speak out against this and saw that this was what Patrick Henry had foretold about the North taxing the South, outvoting but I mean the tariff of 1792 did not pass, and even though he did criticize the administration for this, including Alexander Hamilton, he was still on good terms with both Washington and Hamilton. But who he really did not get on good terms with was Thomas Jefferson. After during John Adams' presidency, Adams, Jefferson, and Lee were dining, and then after Jefferson had gone away, Lee had asked Adams, "What do you think of Jefferson?" And John Adams said, "He's my friend and my vice president." I mean, back then it was everyone everyone was competing for both president and vice president. If you understand, like this is before the 12th Amendment. And what's funny was Lee really didn't like Jefferson, and he was angry at Jefferson for having abandoned Richmond when Jefferson was the governor during the War for Independence, and he didn't see that John Adams should have been more careful, because Jefferson really, although they were friends, Jefferson and Adams, Jefferson wanted the presidency, and eventually he got it. It doesn't. This book really doesn't mention too much about John Marshall, other than he's an ally, and doesn't mention Bushrod Washington at all, who both Marshall and Bushrod were appointed to the Supreme Court by John Adams. And I found that interesting that Bushrod wasn't mentioned. Maybe they didn't really have that much of a relationship, him and Lee, but I don't know. Next, well, I guess I should mention that Light Horse Harry Lee had two wives, and he had several children with both. Robert E. Lee is the third son of the second wife, but the first wife was he had Henry Lee the Fourth, Black Horse Harry Lee, and both he and Black Horse Henry Lee were notorious for speculating with land and getting into massive debt and not getting rich, and I think they both went to debtor's jail. and after on the waning days of Jefferson's presidency, he really gave Jefferson hell. Like really was angry at Jefferson, blamed Jefferson for his debt troubles, and wrote a memoir about the War for Independence, saying that what Jefferson did, abandoning Richmond, was wrong during that time period. And well, yeah, he was trying to make money off of that memoir. Um, and then during the War of 1812, um, he tries. He's a Federalist, right? And the Federalists were against the war, while the Democratic Republicans were for the war, especially the South. What was interesting was John C. Calhoun was mentioned, and as you know, in 1782, that was when he was born. He was born during uh, the closing years of the American War for Independence, and it touches a little. The book touches a little bit on Calhoun, how he was a fiery nationalist, and I mean he would later become uh, the face of states' rights after John Randolph of Roanoke died. But uh, he and also he would before that he would be James Monroe's Secretary of War. But I don't think um, Harry Lee lived to see that, or he might have saw at the very beginning. But during the war, but Calhoun was one of the big supporters of the war. He was one of the war hawks, right? Like Richard Mentor Johnson and Henry Clay. Now, um, if he Harry Lighthorse Lee said that if they had gone to war, he would if he would be called upon to go to war again for against Great Britain, he would. But he was I don't really remember all the details, but he was trying to help this federalist in these federalists in Maryland, and there was a Democratic Republican mob that was attacking them. Um, it was a little bit complicated, but basically, he was maimed for life and really injured in Maryland, and the he and the other Federalists were being called Tories by the Republicans, even though many of those Federalists had battle scars from the War for Independence, and I guess they were called Tories because they were against the war. Most most of the Federalists, but and also before that he was sent by James Monroe, who was the Secretary of State and Secretary of War actually under James Madison to like the Caribbean to talk with the British, and it seemed that they didn't want war. He actually um sorry. There was also but after the after getting maimed by the Republicans in Maryland, some newspapers said he died. So I mean some of the Federalists who actually got mobbed died, or but others like him survived. But the newspapers initially said he died, but he was alive, and he wasn't really there for the children of his second wife. I mean, for the very first son of his second wife, he he was there for 10 years, and he got to know his first son, but his second and third sons and the daughter, they well, I don't remember how many daughters he had with the second wife, but he didn't really get to know the rest of his children with the second wife, and he he was too busy, like either in debtor's jail or something, or Yeah, or like that time in Maryland in which he got beat up. He wasn't there, and later on, Robert E. Lee would learn more about him, like after the war, especially. But um, he died, and people remembered him for being good friends with George Washington. Um, and George Washington, sorry, and you know when in 1817, well, no, 1823, about 1824, um, John C. Calhoun gets to know Robert E. Lee. Um, Robert E. Lee's uncle writes to Calhoun, who's the Secretary of War, that not so much. He doesn't really bring up like his academic prowess. He brings up that Robert comes from a great family. The of like his father still was known as a hero in the Revolution, and uh, because he wanted to be Robert E. Lee wanted to get into West Point, right, and only had a few spots every year. So Robert E. Lee and actually Jefferson Davis, they were I think they were classmates. Yeah, they were both signed off by uh, John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War, and then like officially by James Madison. I don't know the exact details, but certainly Calhoun knew both Lee and Davis. I've mentioned about Davis later. He later served in the Senate with Davis, but towards the end, it really explains that the book really explains that and puts contrasts Robert E. Lee and his father. Robert E. Lee fought more for Virginia for like states' rights, while as most of the time, like his father was a nationalist. His father was considered a moderate Federalist who wanted to bring both sides in, but actually Nathaniel Macon and Robert E. And Harry Lighthouse Lee are contrasted because um, when Washington died and there was going to be a memorial for him, Nathaniel Macon from North Carolina, who was also a Revolutionary War soldier, I think, had said that if we do this, then all the other presidents are going to have memorials, and it's just going to cost a lot of money. While as uh, Harry Lee was really in favor of this monument, and of course he would be because he was friends with George Washington and was, basically on the other end of Nathaniel Macon, and so it did pass the House, but the 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 motion to create a memorial for Washington, but the Senate really lowered the amount of money um, sent to appropriated for this, and I guess Nathaniel Macon. It talked a little bit about how he really did not like debt, and how towards the end of his life he made sure that in his funeral that he wouldn't be in debt to anyone. So I found that really interesting. Nathaniel Macon really outlived Lee by a lot. He lived to see Martin Van Buren become president in 1837. He supported Van Buren in 1836. Um, I think Polk and um, James Buchanan also had really admired Nathaniel Macon. But that's another topic for another day, maybe. Um, we're talking about Lee here, and it contrasts Lee about how Lee went into Pennsylvania to fight against the Union, for fight against the United States. We're talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, and his father went to put down the Whiskey Rebellion over 60 years prior. So this is a very they are really contrasted here. And if so I was thinking during the book, when I was listening to the book, wow, his father was really different from his son, although they were both soldiers. But one was much more nationalistic, and the other was fighting for his own state more. Henry, it seemed like Robert E. Lee cared more about Virginia and Virginia's rights more than his father. But obviously, like to be fair, his father served in House of Delegates and was the governor, and the House of Representatives. He was more of a politician, and he did speak up against being taxed by the administration on, under Secretary with Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Um, what else can I say? Um, we'll move on to like today, like current Canadian politics and linking federalism with like this Canadian federalism with today. With like the book. I'm gonna just say like it's about states' rights. Um, I know that Maxime Bernier had called out Pierre Poilievre and Jean Charest for being federal imperialists on Twitter. Like Jean Charest wanted to force the provinces to reform healthcare, while as Pierre Poilievre would use force to the force the provincial and local governments to change like policies on housing. And if you don't know, if you're listening from America, how there's a housing crisis in Canada in which the prices of houses have risen so much compared to the housing prices in the United States. And um Pierre Poilievre, he seems to be the a very free market guy compared to Jean Charest or Patrick Brown, but he does still want heavy-handed government, like from the federal perspective, like when it comes to this issue, housing. Because I'm looking like at there are six candidates. We can talk about the ones who got disqualified later, but five of them are from Ontario, and Jean Charest is from Quebec. And um, I'm not really seeing too much of states' rights compared to Maxime Bernier. I know Kevin O'Leary is supporting uh, Jean Charest, and back in 2017, after he had dropped out of the leadership race, he backed Bernier. I don't know if this is just Quebecism, like if he's just being a sectionalist because he doesn't even speak French. But like that's part of the reason why he dropped out. And but Bernier and Charest are very different. Both of them are very different. But like even though they're both Quebecers, they're one is so much more decentralist and free market than the other. Um, and I realize like two of the guys who got disqualified. I'm not even sure why. Like the CPC Leadership Election Committee is, it's kind of undemocratic and corrupt. They refused to allow Grant Abraham, who I believe who is a Westerner, and so was Joseph Bourgault, who is from Saskatchewan, so also a Westerner. He said that like the West is being excluded from from the CPC. It's as if the CPC is taking the West for granted, the prairie provinces at least. Mark Dalton, he was a guy I had hoped he would qualify, but he only raised 200,000, and they needed 300,000. to move on to the next stage of um and yes, Mark Dalton, he's an MP. He's from BC's, but yeah, the I feel like the West is getting taken for granted. It's kind of like maybe after Polk had defeated Clay in 1744, the Democrats believed they had the South locked up. That's why in 48 and 52 and 56 they choose dough faces like Northerners would, although those Northerners did have Southern sympathies. You would have Lewis Cass in 48, um, Franklin Pierce in 52, and Buchanan in 56. But certainly there is sectionalism, and I hope maybe it would be good, or who knows, the CPC might split off, kind of like the Reform PC split the conservative vote back in 93 and 97, 2000. Um, and people credit that Jean Chrétien for having three majorities because of that. Because the West was mostly disgruntled Southern Westerners. I'm sorry, while as the PC were the socialist light conservatives, the progressive conservatives, um, from the East. And so yeah, this is um, I don't know. You you can definitely see the sectionalism, except it's not a north south sectionalist. It's a west east sectionalism, sectional strife. And if this leads up to the break of the country, like I'll be happy. Like if Quebec can leave the federation, that would be good. But well, I believe, of course, in nullification and secession, right? And in this case, like the Canadian provinces are more decentralist in that regard compared to the states in the United States. But yeah, right now, yeah, I'm certainly not going to be voting for Patrick Brown or Jean Charest anytime. Like if they become leader, like there's no way these guys are high tax. Like right now, we're in gas prices are through the roof. That's they're over 200 cents per liter, and I've never seen this in my life. Um, like and part of it is inflation, but another part of this is the gas, is the carbon taxes. And that's why like now the conservative premiers like Kenney and Ford, they're cutting down the gas tax. Actually, I think Kenney got rid of it completely. Whereas in BC, they're really high compared to Alberta. Yeah, like Alberta's, I think it's less than 100. It's like 95 cents. Well, I mean, it depends on the area, but in BC, you can see places like over 200 cents because of the carbon tax under NDP Premier John Horgan. Another election we can talk about is the provincial election, and Ford is supposed to be the check. They're supposed to act as a conservative check against the liberal federal government of Justin Trudeau, but he's kind of has a non-aggression pact with him, not really fighting for Ontario too much. When it comes to like COVID, I mean, the premier of Quebec, Francois Legault, is fighting, but it's because he wants his own, totalitarian state, essentially, and he his well as Jean well as Doug Ford, I don't know, I don't really see strength in him as a leader, and I mean that's what I really like. Jim Carahalios, who is running a full slate of members. Um, but I if I think Ford might win. Like I what I think is that Ford is going to is has to win by hoping that the NDP and the Liberals split enough votes, just like back in 2018. This is basically how how the Conservatives are gonna win when the Liberals and the NDP split down the middle, split the leftist vote down the middle. That's how. But it's so crazy how this is how Conservatives win. This is because this doesn't happen in the United States. Um, but I really like the New Blue Party of Ontario, led by Jim Carhalios. His wife was a former PC MPP, Belinda Carhalios, and she she was the only one who was kicked out of former or current PC MPP who was kicked out. No, who voted against Bill 100. It was like the Reopening Ontario Act, which would allow, which would give Premier Ford and his cabinet they would still retain some emergency powers. And she was kicked out, even though Ford said that the only vote that he would have PC MPPs vote on is the budget, and that that was not the budget, so he broke his promise. And it's not like I disagree with the platform of the Ontario Party led by Derek Sloan, but he doesn't have a full slate, and there are some other problems with him. His MPP Rick Nichols voted in 2017, October 2017, on the second reading for abortion bubble zones, which are anti-free speech, and he also voted for Bill 67 recently this year, which was critical race theory. Oh my goodness! So, and then he said later he made a mistake. He didn't understand the legislation, which is a bunch of nonsense because he's been in the Ontario legislature for 3 terms, like over a decade. He should know better than to have voted for this. And it's so sad because they, Belinda and Rick had started off with having a good relationship because Belinda did back him as deputy speaker, and he was removed as deputy speaker. But he got kicked because he didn't take a vaccine, which that sucks, and that shouldn't have happened. Um, but yeah, I mean, I do have problems with Rick Nichols, although like Roger Stone does support the Ontario Party, but it doesn't have a full slate. I wish they would work together, and at least I'm happy that Derek isn't trying to pull votes from Belinda's riding in Cambridge because he does believe that she does deserve to be reelected, but it's I don't know, it's a mess that the people who got kicked out of Ford's caucus were are not really working together at all. I mean, Roman Baber is doing his own thing. Like of course, he's supported by former Conservative MP David Sweet for the CPC leadership race, and he was on the stage. And I don't disagree with most of his policies. I think he's against supply management, which is good, but he should have worked more with the other PC MPPs who got kicked out of caucus while he was still there. Like he had a jobs and jabs bill, which didn't pass, which would have protected people from getting kicked out of their um their job, fired for through vaccination status. But I don't know. Like Belinda said it didn't go far enough, but she still supported it because she wanted to find employees who would kick them out. Um, Randy Hillier, he doesn't really show up to the legislature, so he was just I don't know going to rallies and campaigning with Maxime Bernier, and I don't know his daughter is really hostile to Jim Carhalios. And then let's quickly talk about Jason Kenney. People think Jason Kenney's gonna cheat in his leadership review. because they made it so that it's mail-in ballots in Alberta. I don't know. But he like many of his he's kicked out a couple of guys from caucus, a couple of MLAs. These are members of the Legislative Assembly, but um for dissenting. But there are still some others that are dissenting, and he'll kick them out if he wins. Like he'll give them an ultimatum, say, okay, you now that the leadership, the party membership supports me, uh, you can still stay on together and like just go with me, or you can no longer be a nominee for the next election. Um, but yeah, he some people think he's gonna cheat. I don't know. Danielle Smith and Brian Jean, who were leaders of the opposition and former leaders of the Wild Rose, they'll throw their hat in the ring if Kenney uh doesn't do it. Like I don't know, he's been really bad on civil liberties. And I think I remember saying this on the previous episode of this podcast, but Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri was concerned because he had locked up three pastors. Jason Kenney had locked up three pastors and said, "Wow, Canada is not a place for religious freedom. It should be put on the watch list, like like Iran or something, or some other places in the Middle East." But yeah, um, that's those are all my thoughts. This is I guess this is shorter than usual. I tried to record on my iPhone for the first take, but um, and then I was trying to record in 4K, but the video file was too big, and I couldn't get it on my computer, so I gave up, and this is my second shot. But thanks for listening. Um, I'll to my podcast. I'll be sure to post another podcast in the future. I don't know when, but I haven't decided which book yet to review next. But thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next time. This is Canadian Meets the South.